Who was I then? Adeline Virginia Stephen, the second daughter of Leslie and Julia Stephen, born on the 25th of January 1882, descended from a great many people, some famous, others obscure, born into a large connection, born not of rich parents but well-to-do parents, born into a very communicative, literate, letter-writing, visiting, articulate, late 19th century world.
She was a late Victorian. She started writing in the First World War. She was reacting against her parents' generation. She did the most astonishingly bold, new, dangerous, risky things with the form of the novel. And I think that's still very influential and still actually exciting and pleasurable for people who read it.
One of the things that is unique, I think, in her work and what she was trying to do once she came really to be a modern writer, I mean, with the novel Jacob's Room and then with Mrs. Dalloway, is that she wanted to provide a picture of consciousness.
She writes about what's important, what's the meaning of life, what are we here for, what does it feel like to be alive, how can we find meaning in things, and also what happens minute by minute when we are.
What gives Virginia Woolf that extraordinary power is that she has more verbal sophistication, more verbal skill than anyone else, and she knows it. But what she is writing about are things that everyone experiences. The experience of loneliness, the fear of death, the sense of isolation.
She used in a way, the extremity of the experiences, sometimes the unbearable experiences she had known in her childhood, as material for her work to transform high moments in the novels into something more than prose, I mean, into poetry.
She's very much in our minds as readers and especially as women readers because she was a radical feminist. I think another reason why she's still with us and has such an important afterlife is her lifelong struggle with illness, with mental illness.
But she grew up in what might be called today a dysfunctional family, especially the girls were very badly treated in lots of ways.
And I think that the terrible, courageous, difficult struggle that she had to keep on an even keel and to produce the enormous amount of work that she did is a very haunting story and a very troubling story, and I think it speaks to us today.
The day Mother died, 20-something years ago, the smell of wreaths in the hall is always in the first flowers still. Without remembering the day, I was thinking of her, as I often do, as good a memorial as one could wish.
One of the things that's striking about Virginia Woolf's family is, of course, loss. I mean, that her mother dies when she's young.
When she was 13, died at 49 of heart failure. Her half-sister, who had been looking after them all in what was a turbulent and quite difficult family life with a very domineering and needy father, died soon after.
I think that death was a very important subject for her and that she did suffer mental breakdowns, particularly after her sister Stella's death, her first major breakdown, then after her father's death in 1904, a major breakdown.
Death was defiance. Death was an attempt to communicate. People feeling the impossibility of reaching the centre, which mystically evaded them. Closeness drew apart. Rapture faded. One was alone. There was an embrace in death.
The family environment in which she grew was deeply damaging. Her half-sister was sectioned. Her father exploited her half-sister and then her sister, using them as mothers, little mothers, to look after the rest of the family when he couldn't manage.
It's her father's death that she thinks years later actually liberated her.
Father's birthday. He would have been 96. Yes, today. and could have been 96, like other people one has known. Mercifully, it was not. His life would have entirely ended mine. What would have happened? No writing? No books? Inconceivable.
Basically, all of her novels and all of her work would have been impossible if he had lived.
And her brother, Toby, died in his 20s, a couple of years after that. So there was this series from the age of 13 through to the age of 24 of hammer blows, which were accompanied by very perilous and troublesome times for her, a number of very major breakdowns, during some of which she tried to kill herself.
In the first place, it is not true to say that when the door opened and with a curious hesitation and self-effacement, Turner or Strachey glided in, that they were complete strangers to us. We had met them, and Bell, Woolf, Hilton Young, and others in Cambridge at May Week, before my father died.
So it was quite a surprise to her friends and her family when she decided to marry Leonard Woolf.
Virginia Woolf famously teased her unmarried friends when she got engaged to Leonard Woolf, saying, "I'm marrying a penniless Jew." She actually was courageous about it because, on the face of it, they were very different people.
He was a civil servant who'd been working in Ceylon, as it then was. She had a middle-class Jewish family whom she didn't like at all, deeply in love with him in her own way, and also horribly anti-Semitic in many of the things that she says.
But she and Leonard were very dependent upon one another and a remarkable couple who spent a great deal of time together and obviously did so very successfully.
They also rowed like mad.
Oh, dear. We quarrelled almost all morning, and it was a lovely morning, and now gone to Hades forever, branded with marks of our ill humour. Which began it? Which carried it on? God knows. This I will say. I exploded, and Elle smoulders. However, quite suddenly, we made it up, but the morning was wasted.
They were very political. He became a very important central figure in the socialist movement in his time. He was a literary editor, he was a journalist, and he had a regime. He knew that she could easily fall ill. She fell violently ill soon after their marriage and was more or less incarcerated for about 2 years. This is during the First World War.
15 years ago, she had gone under. It was nothing you could put your finger on. There'd been no scene, no snap. Only the slow sinking, waterlogged, of her will into his.
Leonard Woolf at first trusted medical opinion, and he took her to see the eminent Sir Henry Head in September 1913, and Virginia Woolf went away from that doctor's appointment and took an overdose of Veronal and only survived because her stomach was pumped out in time.
And Leonard Woolf made a crucial decision, which was not to have her sent to an asylum. He was going to look after her.
He must have suffered in the marriage, but his sense of the personal, not the literary or social value of his wife, was so strong and so extreme that he was willing to suppress himself for her sake.
And I read this as a form of sympathetic, practical guardianship, and not as a form of tyranny or constriction or repression.
But it does seem to me that Leonard Woolf was very protective and almost, yes, in a motherly role to his wife. But maybe it came too late.
I was interrupted somewhere on this page by the arrival of Mr. Eliot. Mr. Eliot is well expressed by his name. A polished, cultivated, elaborate young American, talking so slow that each word seems to have special finish allotted it.
She could be very snobbish, she could be very snarky. You didn't want to trust her with a secret because she'd immediately go off and tell 6 other people. She could be fantastically rude and condescending.
Christopher Isherwood talks about how Virginia Woolf was one of the great conversationalists, but also one of the great gossips in the world. And I think all of that goes hand in hand. She was an observer. She observed herself. She observed other people.
I don't like old ladies who guzzle. My comment upon Ethel Smythe last night, no doubt a harsh one, but she champed and chopped and squabbled over her duck and then was overeaten and had to go home.
She could be savage. She was a terrible snob. She could be extremely funny about her friends and talk about them in ways that were extremely cutting.
She was very snarky about the middle classes and the middle brow. She was extremely unfair to very good novelists like Arnold Bennett because she thought he was too taken up with the material world.
So far, no gossip and no soul. Yet I've seen Bob, Desmond, Lytton, Sebastian Sprott, Dorothy Bussey, Mrs. Elliot, this last making me almost vomit. So scented, so powdered, so egotistic, so morbid, so weakly.
She is fantastically intolerant and bigoted in many ways. All this is part of the wild energy of her creative imagination, but it's the sort of dark side. And I think it is related to her mental illness and to her anxiety about being vulnerable. When her friend, with whom she had a very conflicted relationship, Catherine Mansfield, first came to visit, she said,
"The dinner last night went off. The delicate things were discussed. We could both wish that one's first impression of K.M. was not that she stinks like a, well, civet cat that had taken to street walking."
Virginia Woolf was very hard and judgmental of her friends, but I think she was also very harsh and judgmental of herself. And so she didn't let herself off easy as an artist, or even recognizing some of her impatience, to put it kindly, with other people. And so you find in her diaries and her letters self-criticism as pungent as her criticism of other people.
Here are my resolutions for the next 3 months, the next lap of the year. First, to have none. Not to be tied. Second, to be free and kindly with myself, not goading it to parties. To sit, rather privately reading in the studio. To make a good job of The Waves.
And here she is at the end of The Waves. And I think I should preface this by saying that in her diary, when she put her pen down after writing these immortal words, she felt very close to mental illness.
Here, in the few minutes that remain, I must record, heaven be praised, the end of The Waves. I wrote the words, "O death," 15 minutes ago. It is death. Death is the enemy. It is death against whom I ride with my spear couched and my hair flying back like a young man's. Like Percival's when he galloped in India, I strike spurs into my horse. Against you I will fling myself, unvanquished and unyielding, O death. The waves broke on the shore.
Virginia Woolf thought of The Waves in part as a memorial to her brother Toby, and she talked about weeping when she was thinking about Toby while writing the book.
Anyhow, it is done, and I have been sitting these 15 minutes in a state of glory and calm and some tears, thinking of Toby.
And it is at the end of the novel the image of a wave starting again, and the wave become it's a bit like the continuity of life or eternity in time, that the waves come again and again and again.
Yes, this is the eternal renewal, the incessant rise and fall and rise again. And in me too, the wave rises, it swells, it arches its back. I am aware once more of a new desire, something rising beneath me, like the proud horse whose rider first spurs and then pulls back.
But then there's always another wave rising far out. And that is crucial to Virginia Woolf's psyche and her achievement, that she was always conscious of that other wave rising, recuperating itself.
After Leslie Stephen died in 1904, the family, which was the two brothers, Toby and Adrian, and Virginia's sister, Vanessa, who became a painter, moved to the area of London that's called Bloomsbury.
In fact, the dominion that Bloomsbury exercises over the sane and insane alike seems to be sufficient to turn the brains of the most robust. Happily, I'm Bloomsbury myself, and thus immune. But I'm not altogether ignorant of what they mean, and it's a hypnotism very difficult to shake off, because there's some foundation for it.
But it was a life of young people finding their own way, making lots of ridiculous mistakes, falling into all kinds of complicated relationships, and above all, talking honestly and candidly about sex, about homosexuality, about their feelings, about art, about politics, because they felt, all of them in their different ways, that they'd grown up in an environment where you couldn't speak the truth.
I thus detect another element in the shame which I had at being caught looking at myself in the glass in the hall. I must have been ashamed or afraid of my own body. Another memory, also of the hall, may help to explain this. There was a slab outside the dining room door for standing dishes upon. Once, when I was very small, Gerald Duckworth lifted me onto this, and as I sat there, he began to explore my body.
It's a wrong conclusion, I think, to draw from that experience that she simply, from that time on, suffered with insoluble mental problems. Now, it obviously contributed to who she was and to her fragility, but that puts us at a loss when we look at how much she transcended that suffering, real suffering, and how much she was able to do with her art and her work and how productive she was.
You know, her own experience of sexual abuse, whatever it exactly was, she's recorded it. She said that, you know, her brother George would rush into her bedroom at night.
Sleep had almost come to me. The room was dark, the house silent. Then, creaking stealthily, the door opened. Treading gingerly, someone entered. "Who?" I cried. "Don't be frightened," George whispered. "And don't turn on the light. Oh, beloved, beloved." And he flung himself on my bed and took me in his arms.
In the episode of her being abused by her half-brothers, there is no sense that there was anybody to talk to about it or to know about it, and there was nobody to stop them. Must have increased this sense of not being protected and not being able to protect herself. And when the sense of exposure became too great, or when the whatever it was rushed in her, she couldn't cope.
So there was abuse, and she had reason to fear men, reason to fear male sexuality. And I think that why she was so bonded with her Bloomsbury group is that this was a civilized group in her terms. The men were civilized in that they believed in the same values as she believed, that one must care for other people, that one must be responsible.
Virginia Woolf is often accused of being an egotist or a narcissist, and she was indeed deeply interested in her own experiences and emotions. And she, in her diaries and in her letters, she analyses herself all the time, moment by moment, and she is extremely up and down. She's a very volatile character.
The day after my birthday. In fact, I'm 38. Well, I've no doubt that I'm a great deal happier than I was at 28, and happier today than I was yesterday, having this afternoon arrived at some idea of a new form for a new novel.
So if you're going to write fiction about which she thought should be about people, because fiction is basically about human beings, how do you do it? The old conventions which she saw in the 19th century novel and the early 20th century, what used to be called the Edwardian novel, she didn't think worked for her.
She largely avoids these kind of large social novels where you're seeing upstairs and downstairs at the same time.
She had known happiness, intense happiness, and it silvered the rough waves a little more brightly. As daylight faded and the blue went out of the sea, and it rolled in waves of pure lemon which curved and swelled and broke upon the beach, and the ecstasy burst in her eyes, and waves of pure delight raced over the floor of her mind, and she felt, it is enough. It is enough.
Such moments are inhabited by a much larger rhythm than a lot of other passages, and I think are moments where some kind of ecstasy is reached. I mean, in fact, almost orgasmic ecstasy. She cries at a point, "It is enough, it is enough," and I think that's very much a female cry.
So she wants to turn the focus away from the traditional subjects of fiction into the shadows of moments of being and the inner life. And to do this, she has to develop a new style. So there's a rationale for the lengthening of her sentences and the fragmented narrative, because she begins to inject silences into her narrative. She accepts the fact that there is much one cannot define or even record, and one's got to allow for what can't be said.
She's trying to get a narrative that moves like water inside other people's minds and lives, and then goes back out again, very interested in nature and the natural world, and then goes back in again.
I faint, I fail. Now my body thaws, I am unsealed, I am incandescent. Now the stream pours in a deep tide, fertilizing, opening the shut, forcing the tight folded, flooding free. To whom shall I give all that now flows through me from my warm, my porous body?
Part of this has to do with her sense of what is unique about every individual human being and what every human being has in common. She's aware of the way in which, say, everyone has a body that is different, but everyone has a body in the same way.
She thought of life as something dangerous, and she was extremely sensitized to what was going on around her, always from the first. She kept in her mind all her life very, very vivid memories of childhood. For instance, of going to the house in Cornwall where they went for 3 months every summer down in St Ives.
So when she was growing up, I mean, at St Ives, there's a great sense of place that's later put into the lighthouse.
Well, Leonard has read To the Lighthouse and says it is much my best book, and it is a masterpiece. He said this without my asking.
There's a family called the Ramsays who are very closely based on Virginia Woolf's parents and her siblings.
At the beginning of To the Lighthouse, when James is with his mother and there is some hope of going to the lighthouse, she donates to James the kind of high sensitivity that was hers and that she wrote about her own childhood, and the interruption that comes from the father saying it won't be fine tomorrow, which means they won't be able to go, brings out of James an extreme violence, a sort of murderous violence in relation to the father.
Had there been an axe handy, a poker or any weapon that would have gashed a hole in his father's breast and killed him, there and then, James would have seized it. Such were the extremes of emotion that Mr. Ramsay excited in his children's breasts by his mere presence.
You see them in the house all focused around Mrs. Ramsay, and you see her in a kind of combative and complicated relationship with her very needy, demanding, obstreperous literary husband.
I suppose that I did for myself what psychoanalysts do for their patients. I used to think of father and mother daily, but writing The Lighthouse laid them in my mind.
Virginia Woolf certainly turns unbearable experiences like the abuse she has suffered into poetry very strikingly in the Time Passes section of To the Lighthouse, because the decay of the house resonates on so many levels. I think it also means a psyche, a self, under the assault of a form of destruction that is very subtle.
And the young woman who's observed all this in the first half and who's sort of fallen in love with Mrs. Ramsay is a painter called Lily. And she's painting a painting of Mrs. Ramsay in the first part of the novel. And in the last part of the novel, she gets this painting out again and she thinks about it and she tries to start it again. But Mrs. Ramsay, of course, isn't there.
Mrs. Ramsay, she cried, feeling the old horror come back. To want and not have. Mrs. Ramsay, it was part of her perfect goodness to Lily, sat there quite simply in the chair, flicked her needles to and fro, knitted her reddish-brown stocking, cast her shadow on the step. There she sat.
But this appearance is like what the novel has done is bring her back from the dead. So it makes the novel into a kind of ghost story in a very surprising way.
The kind of triumph that Lily Briscoe had at the end of To the Lighthouse seems to be the same triumph that Virginia Woolf felt when she finished The Waves. She wrote in her diary that, in effect, she let herself go. She simply felt herself riding on the wave of the prose and felt, I'm paraphrasing hopelessly here, a tremendous exhilaration of a kind she had never imagined before.
If you look at To the Lighthouse, it's obviously about a certain kind of family of a certain class, and then there are other characters, the artist Lily Briscoe and other people, that gives you a sense Virginia Woolf understands more than just about her own world.
Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself.
The beginning of Mrs. Dalloway, where Clarissa Dalloway, who is a society hostess, goes out to buy the flowers for the party that she's having that evening. It couldn't be more trivial. It couldn't be more superficial. And off she goes, this middle-aged woman who's recently been very ill. And she goes into the streets of London. You see them sort of shimmering with activity and busyness, and everybody absolutely relieved that the war is over and they can go to parties and go shopping. But under it, you're going to see the corpses. You're going to feel and hear and see the millions of corpses and deaths that underlie this shimmering surface.
So in Mrs. Dalloway in particular, you have all of the thoughts of Clarissa Dalloway that will tell you as the reader what Clarissa Dalloway is like, with an occasional turn outward where there is a third person watching Clarissa Dalloway to tell us what she looks like, so that the novel can be a seamless view inside Clarissa Dalloway's mind, but situated firmly on the streets of London in a realistic way.
Doctors in the early 20th century, when faced with manic depression or bipolar disorder, didn't really know what to do. So they invented regimes. And that's spelt out very dramatically in Mrs. Dalloway.
Where Septimus Warren Smith feels so completely porous, as it were, exposed. I mean, his own fibre is continuous with the wind in the leaves or the birds flying.
There remained only the window, the large Bloomsbury lodging house window, the tiresome, the troublesome, and rather melodramatic business of opening the window and throwing himself out.
Virginia Woolf did make use of her mental breakdowns. When she wrote Mrs. Dalloway, she gave to Septimus Warren Smith the same mad experiences that she had had, hearing the birds singing in Greek, for example, in the trees. And what she was doing was identifying with someone utterly different from herself and recognizing the breakdown as a misery.
But he would wait till the very last moment. He did not want to die.
She treats Septimus Warren Smith's suicide as a kind of triumph. He refuses to give in to the doctors who want to shut him away from those he loves and those and the doctor who wants to treat him as a set of symptoms rather than as a person.
There he lay with a thud, thud, thud in his brain, and then a suffocation of blackness.
She always writes in this voice which tries to get in and out of people's minds and feelings. And if you say I, if you write a first-person novel, you cut yourself off from doing that. So she never does that. There is no I in the fiction. There is plenty of I in the essays and in the letters and the diaries, but not in the fiction.
We began our printing off this afternoon, and we printed 300 copies of the first page of Prelude, but we should be glad of another press.
The Hogarth Press was started actually as a sort of a therapeutic hobby that Leonard Woolf thought would be really good at a time when Virginia Woolf had been ill. So they bought this small hand press and some type in 1915. And then nothing really happened for a couple of years because she was so ill. And then they started printing by hand small, short essays and stories. So what's remarkable about the Hogarth Press is two things. One, it started as this very small, rather amateurish operation on the kitchen table in Richmond, and it grew into one of the most important, influential, radical publishing houses in England. The other thing it did, of course, was to free her from the constraints of having to write under the thumb of another publisher, who in the first instance, the publisher of her first two novels, was her half-brother, Duckworth, whom she had had an unpleasant relationship with in her childhood.
I have worked very methodically and done my due of articles, so that with luck I shall have made £320 by journalism, and I suppose at least £300 by my novel this year.
She was very proud that her books earned money, and she writes with great energy about the importance of an independent income for women writers. It's one of the key stories of her life, that women needed to earn money in order to be free of constrictions.
The history of men's opposition to women's emancipation is more interesting, perhaps, than the story of that emancipation itself.
So her childhood, the conditions of her childhood, affected her feeling as she came into the public and social world about the radical injustices to women who couldn't vote, couldn't own property, who were the possessions of their husbands, and whose writing was done historically under tremendous difficulties.
We went to a meeting called a suffrage rally in Kingsway this afternoon. The hall was fairly well filled, the audience almost wholly women, as the speakers were too.
So she wrote two main books about this, one in the 20s and one in the 30s. The first one was A Room of One's Own, which is an extremely famous, long-lasting and influential essay about women writers. And it's also about education for women. It started life as 2 lectures for women undergraduates at Cambridge.
Thank God my long toil at the women's lecture is this moment ended. I am back from speaking at Girton in floods of rain. Starved but valiant young women, that's my impression. Intelligent, eager, poor, and destined to become schoolmistresses in shoals. I blandly told them to drink wine and have a room of their own.
And in this, she very wittily and charmingly and funnily describes the history of women writers and talks about ways in which women might be free.
She lays bare the structure of society as it is constructed along gender lines, as in A Room of One's Own, or along economic lines and gender lines, the patriarchy in her later book, 3 Guineas.
Elle gravely approves 3 Guineas, thinks it's an extremely clear analysis.
In the context of the gathering fascist movement in Europe, and indeed in this country, she writes a much angrier, much less palatable essay called 3 Guineas in the late 30s, where she makes an equation between the patriarchal tyranny of the Victorian household and what is happening in the fascist movement. So she draws a very bold and very angry comparison between the kind of fathers that existed in Victorian families who prevented their daughters from having an education or going out to work, and the way in which someone like Mussolini was encouraging a macho, warlike, aggressive, repressive way of thinking about the world.
She expresses her horror at the violence, both domestic and military, that men have perpetrated over all the centuries. That women had to go far beyond the vote if they were ever going to achieve or do down that brutal society that destroys so many lives.
You have only to look round the world now to see that 3 Guineas is a book of great importance and necessity to us still.
I am pleased this morning because Lady Rhonda writes that she is profoundly excited and moved by the 3 Guineas. A good omen, because this shows that certain people will be stirred, will think, will discuss. It won't altogether be frittered away. But as the whole of Europe may be in flames, it's on the cards. One more shot at a policeman, and the Germans, Czechs, French will begin the old horror.
And I think one of the politically impressive things about Woolf is the way that she's open to all kinds of different friendships. The marriage is there throughout her life as a very strong base. But she's going to have adventures, emotional and intellectual adventures. One of the most intense and dramatic of these was with Vita Sackville-West.
Well, Vita Sackville-West came into Virginia Woolf's life at the end of 1922, and she had admired Virginia Woolf's writing, and she asked Clive Bell, who was Virginia Woolf's brother-in-law, the husband of her sister Vanessa Bell, to introduce her to Virginia.
I am too muzzy-headed to make out anything. This is partly the result of dining to meet the lovely, gifted aristocrat Sackville-West last night at Clive's. Knows everyone, but could I ever know her? I am to dine there on Tuesday. The aristocratic manner is something like an actress's, no false shyness or modesty. Makes me feel virgin, shy and schoolgirlish.
Who, unlike Virginia Woolf, was a known sapphist, as this was then called, and she had all kinds of spectacular affairs with women. She too was married and had a long and friendly companionship with her husband, Harold Nicholson.
Vita comes to lunch tomorrow, which will be a great amusement and pleasure. I am amused at my relations with her, left so ardent in January, and now what? Also, I like her presence and her beauty. Am I in love with her? But what is love?
And it was only after 2 or 3 years of the first meeting that they became, in any sense, intimate. And of course, as the world now knows, they became lovers.
And they did clearly have an affair.
Almost immediately, there was this great sense of attraction. Virginia notes in her diary about Vita somewhat dismissively, at the same time as you can sense this great attraction.
And quite critical of Vita as well. She calls her Donkey West. She thinks she's stupid. She thinks she's a bit thick. She's a sort of thick aristocrat as far as Virginia Woolf's concerned. She's very rude to her, very critical of her. And all that comes out in her book Orlando.
And instantly the usual exciting devices enter my mind. A biography beginning the year 1500 and continuing to the present day called Orlando.
Which, of course, was a biography, she called it, of vita, but in a most fantastic method. That Orlando starts off as a boy and halfway through the book changes into a woman, but has still the same character, and it was the character, of course, of Vita herself. And the book really forms the longest and most charming love letter in the whole of English literature.
Here is a whole nervous breakdown in miniature. Wednesday, only wish to be alone in the open air. Thursday, no pleasure in life whatsoever. Friday, sense of physical tiredness, but slight activity of the brain.
Virginia Woolf suffered from mental illness, which at one point was called neurasthenia, came to be called manic depression, would now be called bipolar, a bipolar state. So she would have periods of extreme intense activity and elation, and she would have periods in which she sank into deep depression and anxiety. At their worst, these involved suicide attempts. She suffered from fantastically bad headache, terrible headaches.
I've been in bed a week with a sudden and very sharp headache, and this is written experimentally to test my brain.
And one of the ironies of the treatment of mental illness in the late teens, early 20s, was to rest completely. And so sometimes when Virginia Woolf was most fragile, she was kept on a milk diet and doing absolutely no work at all. And that was actually more dangerous in a certain way than actually overwork.
It's extremely hard to tell from the evidence that you can put together of her conditions whether actually some of the phases of the hallucination or some of the physical symptoms that accompanied her depressions might have been the result of the drug she was given.
She herself had had such dire experiences at the hands of the doctors trying to treat her after her breakdown, after her mother's death, after her father's death, and at other points, that she consciously or unconsciously associated Freud and the claim for science that psychoanalysis gave itself with those doctors who, from their superior position as men of science, had said what was wrong with her and what could be good for her, neither of which corresponded with anything of her own sense of herself and her own sense of her experience.
She was never psychoanalysed, and she didn't want to be psychoanalysed. And although Leonard at the Hogarth Press and she were publishing the translations of Freud, the place was littered with volumes of Freud in translation, which for years and years and years she didn't pick up, she wasn't interested in, and she was resistant to, because she clearly was extremely anxious that psychoanalysis or reading Freud would somehow stop her from functioning or make her too aware of herself. So one of the very interesting things that happens very late in her life is that she starts reading Freud.
It was only the other day when I read Freud for the first time that I discovered that this violently disturbing conflict of love and hate is a common feeling, and it is called ambivalence.
And although their views of what was wrong with the world, for him, the patriarchy breaking down, and for her, the loss of any kind of a mother, of motherly values. I mean, they were not of a mind, but I think that there was real sympathy and probably real mutual understanding and respect.
I have seen Mary Stopes, Princess de Polignac, Philip and Pippin Wolfe, and Dr. Freud in the last 3 days. Dr. Freud gave me a Narcissus.
I think the last couple of years of Virginia Woolf's life were really harrowing in many ways.
They came very close. We lay down under a tree. The sound was like someone soaring in the air just above us. We lay flat on our faces, hands behind head. "Don't close your teeth," said Al. They seemed to be soaring at something stationary. Bombs shook the windows of my lodge. I think, of nothingness, flatness, my mood being flat. Some fear, I suppose.
There were shortages, food, petrol, all of that. Their house was bombed in London, bombed to smithereens in Tavistock Square, when they went up to salvage what they could in a blitzed London.
Back from half a day in London, perhaps our strangest visit. Mecklenburgh Square, roped off. Wardens there, not allowed in. The house about 30 yards from ours, struck at 1 this morning by a bomb. Completely ruined. Another bomb in the square, still unexploded. That is a great pile of bricks, underneath all the people who had gone down to their shelter.
The things she rescued were her diaries, the volumes of her diaries, partly because she was writing about her childhood. She was writing a memoir, which I think she found both painful and also consoling. She was finishing a novel, and that was always a very perilous moment for her. The novel was about a country on the brink of war, and she thought it was hopeless. She often thought her own work was hopeless. She sank into a tremendous depression about that. There was a real sense of imminent invasion. They knew that because Leonard was Jewish and they were both radicals and socialists and had written, against Nazism, they knew very well that they would be on, as indeed they were, on Hitler's blacklist. So they had discussed suicide very rationally in the event of an invasion.
But though El says he has petrol in the garage for suicide should Hitler win, we go on. It's the vastness and the smallness that makes this possible.
I hadn't realised the impact that the war, that stage of the war, had on her. I mean, the strain of the feeling the bomb was going to be invaded and all that. I mean, she and Leonard had decided to blow themselves up in their garage if Hitler invaded England, quite literally.
And I think all these different things created a situation for her which she couldn't see a way out of. So I think that her suicide on a cold day in March in 1941 was a decision, not something that she did without mental control.
I hadn't realised that she felt that she was going to go mad again. So that this, although we were living close by at the time, and I saw her a few days before it happened, and I realised that she was under the weather, and she made this sort of tremendous demand for love that she was in the habit of making, rather. I mean, she would, particularly, I think just because I was an undemonstrative child, she would quite often say, "But Angelica, don't you love me? Don't you adore me? Do you? You know you hate me, you don't like me at all," this sort of way of going on. But she did it particularly on that day, and of course, I mean, as I remember it, I was particularly cold and undemonstrative on that day. And then the next thing I heard, a telephone call to say that she had drowned herself.